this is how I decided what type of therapy I wanted to do. This this is how I decided what type of therapy I wanted to do. This is how I decided what this is this is how I decided what type of therapy I wanted to do. So when I was younger, as any other teenager, I needed so when I was younger as any other teen so when I was younger as any other teenager, I needed to go to therapy. I started I started a psychoanalytic I started I started a I started I started a I started a psychoanalytic therapy, but we're gonna leave that for another video. Part 1. Part 1. I later found out I later found out that psychoanalytic therapy many mi amor. Vení acá, vení acá. She wanted to participate in the video too. She wanted to participate in the video too. So later on I found out that psychoanalytic therapy. Mira la cámara. So later on I found out that psychoanalytic therapy didn't have any evidence and that cognitive behavioral therapy would help me with my anxiety attacks. And it did work for some time. And it did work for some time with the amazing help of SSRIs. But there was something missing. No, she left. All that homework based on writing, reframing, and questioning my thoughts felt so robotic to do. And even though I ended up understanding my cognitive bias, and even though I ended up understanding my bias, I still felt that controlling anxiety that way didn't really cut it. Now CBT is based now CBT is now CBT is based Now CBT is based on the assumption that we feel the way we feel because we think in a biased way. Therefore, this model tries to this Therefore, this model tries to control, modify. Therefore, this model tries to control, reduce, or modify thinking through many different approaches. This idea, the problem is the problem is that this idea that our biased way of thinking causes our psychological distress is more of a correlation than a causation. The idea that our biased way of thinking is what causes our psychological distress has many gaps in the theory, and it sounds more like a correlation than a causation. For psychological pain, that is. So that idea that our psychological distress, that idea that our psychological distress is based by a biased way of thinking. Podés bajarte, gorda, bajate. So that idea that our psychological distress is caused. So this idea that we feel bad because we think in a biased way has a lot of theoretical gaps, and it sounds more like a correlation than a causation of the psychological pain. But there's another level to it. And that is that this happens because there is an underlying idea here that there is an underlying idea here that has to do there is an underlying idea here that comes from medicine that states that pain is something to be controlled or reduced. It's something to eliminate. If you saw my video on why if you saw my video on why trying to eliminate psychological if you saw my video on problem solving as an approach to solving psychological pain, or you just paid a little bit of attention to ¿Te bajas? Or you paid a little attention in your life when you tried to remove all negative experience and only feel the good. You'd know that the problem only gets worse. You'd know that the problem only gets worse. You know that the problem only gets worse the more that you try to control it. So later on, I found acceptance and commitment therapy. And so later on, I found acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and it completely changed everything. But I leave that for part two. What was your experience with? I know that CBT is one of the most common approaches, so what was your experience with it?